There we go. Okay, so as we get started today, just a couple of quick announcements. Really, the major announcements for today are just to remind people of our save the dates. And if one of my co-hosts could help put that into the Google chat, the registration link for our Google page that we use, the upcoming dates are listed here, and we'll also be getting more information out to you about who will be talking. And if you have any suggestions of folks to present, please let me know. Or if there's something you would like to do during this time, also let us know. As a reminder, our talks are part of the series that's focusing on the handbook of positioning theory that has just come out. This is available in the hard copy, which unfortunately is quite expensive. You might ask your library to order it, but it is also available in digital copies as well that are much more reasonable. So again, if you're interested in that, you can follow up on looking for that. And if somebody has the link there, you could put it in the chat. I won't go over the parts of the handbook for you, but you can find those on the web. So today's talk, without any further ado, will be from the first talk will be from myself. I'll introduce my co-authors in a minute. Unfortunately, neither of them could be here. And our second presenter is Pasi Hirvonen, who'll be talking about conversation analysis and positioning theory. So the chapter that I'll be talking about is a positioning theory, narrative, and narrative analysis. Um, I see that somehow the university got stuck at the bottom of that. So the chapter part's just this first part at the top. My co-authors on this piece are Zhiyi and Kristian Douglas. Neither of them could be here today, but they were instrumental in getting this chapter out and together. Also, just a little plug for our Finland conference last summer. What you see behind Zhiyi there is Finland when we were out on the lake. So Pasi, that might look familiar to you. Okay, so getting into this chapter, part of what we were interested in doing in the chapter was really exploring parts of what has sometimes been apparent in the positioning work, which is that this branching off that you see in this representation, which is the positioning theory tree that is in the handbook, but also has been developed elsewhere and has been evolving over time. This is just one representation to think about positioning theory, but you'll see that there's a branching off of the Hooray, Mogadam, Van Langenhove branches and the Bamberg and Davies branches. And I've always been interested because of my work in narrative, how sometimes people will pull from Michael Bamberg's work and also others will pull from Hooray and colleagues, but sometimes there's not as much interweaving or cross-pollination or whatever the term is that we want to use between these approaches. So we wanted to explore that a little bit and also look into some of the narrative aspects of positioning theory. So the purpose was to provide some history on the narrative turn, point to several forms of narrative analysis and positioning, and discuss also in particular the what I call the Bamberg branch, Michael Bamberg's work, and work from social interactional analysis. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Michael said he couldn't be here today but he's teaching. But he was very helpful in giving feedback on this chapter, although any representations or misrepresentations, if as such, are the responsibility of the authors. But I do appreciate Michael's perspectives. So some influences on positioning theory. What was happening, a lot of folks use that anchor piece from 1990 from Davies and Hooray as their starting point, but there was a lot of work going on around narrative at that time. So just reminding folks of some of that key work. Actual Minds, Possible Worlds by Jerome Bruner was published in 1986. So this centered narrative and aspects of mind that created stories, and the imagined possible worlds as social, not merely individual processes. This was linked to some of the criticisms that Bruner and also Ram Hare and others had raised, which is this concern over the overemphasis on mental processes and cognitive states, and affect the cognitive, what some have referred to as a second cognitive revolution. But a lot of this was also centered around narrative in different ways. Also, the notion of the discursive mind, this idea that mind is a social construction and that our concepts arise from discourse. So a key piece here is Hooray and Gillette, as well as others. So these are things that were happening around the time of the publication of the first positioning theory piece by Davies and Hooray. Some of you may be familiar with this term, the narrative turn. This also refers to what was happening in psychology, but also in other fields: law, education, linguistics, medicine, life history narratives, structural analysis, discourse analysis, critical discourse studies, and narrative as performance or interaction. So this was really happening across a lot of different fields at this time. So there's a lot of different narrative influences that were uh, surfacing across disciplines. I also want to point to, just briefly, a little bit of the work that Davies and Hooray themselves brought in terms of narrative. So one of the things that's been really interesting about working on the handbook and reading all the different chapters that authors worked on, as well as trying to look into some of this history as well, is just thinking about how, even though oftentimes the Davies and Hooray piece published in 1990, positioning the discursive production of self, is oftentimes cited as a beginning point. There was really a point before that where Davies and Hooray were each doing their own individual scholarship and working on various things. Bronwyn Davies had done studies of primary school children, really embedded studies that were working with looking at how children perceive their worlds. Life in the Classroom and the Playground is one of those early books that she published. Other folks may be familiar with her work related to gender, such as Shards of Glass, Children Reading and Writing Beyond Gendered Identities, and also Frogs and Snails, Feminist Tales. So while these didn't foreground narrative analysis per se, stories and narrative threads are really important in this. A later work by Bronwyn Davies also focuses on doing collective biography, which is another interesting thread in narrative research. Ram Hare also focused on narrative in some different ways. He considered narratives and narratology. That was one of the things that he wrote about, particularly narratives for organizing actions in relation to Wittgenstein and others. He also looked at narrative and scientific discourse and wrote about the ways that scientific discourse makes use of narratives, including the way that narratives include objective rhetoric and specific pronouns to make clear a scientist's moral authority. So one of the quotes from Hooray that I included here from the chapter is that he wrote, "So far, I have concentrated on those narrative conventions by means of which a personal story is told so that the narrator appears in the guise of a modest but competent subscriber to the moral order in which he or she wishes to be seen to be a member. But scientific discourse is made complex from a narratological point of view by virtue of the interweaving of another storyline. It is a narrative of objectivity, of human indifference. So Hare was interested in this notion of how narrative played a part in scientific discourse and the present of that narratological position, we might say. So obviously, there's also a lot of relevance in terms of thinking about narrative. If we think about the positioning triad or positioning triangle, the notion that positioning can be understood as the discursive construction of personal stories that make a person's actions intelligible and relatively determinate as social acts, and within which the members of the conversation have specific locations. And this is a quote from Hooray and Van Langenhove, 1991. And obviously, in terms of thinking about the positioning triangle, which a lot of folks do use in their positioning work, that notion of storyline is embedded in that, but also throughout this, the idea of stories in relation to positions and specific locations. So again, the narrative aspects of positioning theory, I would say, are there throughout, even if they're not always foregrounded in some of the analysis that is done. There is also an emphasis on ever shifting positions. So the other aspect of this that's important is to think about the dynamic nature of position in relation to storyline and narrative. So Hooray and Van Langenhove, for example, explored autobiography as reflective positioning. And one of the things that they critiqued was the idea of lifespan research that privileged literary structures, so a less dynamic structure. So one of the reasons for thinking about autobiography as reflexive positioning was to introduce some of that notion of the dynamic nature of positioning and story. Hooray and Van Langenhove also distinguished between orality and written autobiography, again, noting the ever-shifting position of spoken stories because they can shift much more rapidly. So written stories can also have some of that dynamic nature, but there is a difference, obviously, if we're interacting with others. Throughout these early writings and across the work that Ram Hare and Luc van Langenhove, Ali Moghadam did, there's often a pointing to need for methodological developments and methods of analysis are mentioned, sometimes explored, less often illustrated, although notably Ali Moghadam in the 2008 edited volume that he put together had as one of its purposes to really explore more of the methodological. So there was more explanation in some of those chapters. Depperman has noted that part of the contribution here is that the theoretical underpinnings and a conceptual apparatus for positioning as an analytic tool were provided in some of these early parts, even while the methodological aspects may not have been as fully developed or present in some of these pieces. So there are some limitations that we arrived at in the chapter, and I think that a number of folks have noticed that more detailed methodological procedures and analysis would be helpful to a lot of folks who are doing this positioning work. And then also, I would argue that there's a need for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary uh, less siloed approaches to this. Part of the reason for that is that it's always been interesting to me that sometimes folks who follow this branch of Hooray and Van Langenhove and are doing positioning analysis don't seem to be aware. And here I'm talking about more the applied folks in different fields. So when I'm reviewing journal articles, some folks seem to be unaware that there's all of this work that has been done, for example, around narrative analysis or discourse analytic methods from Bamberg and colleagues. And so I think that if we are aware of that, we can put some of those methodological aspects into use. So in the chapter, we mentioned three different approaches to narrative and positioning, and I'll just talk about these very briefly. Life history is one approach, and this can be used with positioning analysis as well. Actually, Jack Martin writes about this in chapter 4 of the handbook, life positioning analysis. But also, this notion of life history reflects that earlier narrative turn and shift in the field. So one of the things that is indicative of that is originally the Journal of Narrative and Life History did include the term life history, and I believe it was under Michael Bamberg's tenure as an editor that that was shifted to narrative inquiry to really open up spaces for other types of narrative approaches, not just life history. Some of those other approaches also involve structural analysis. So the work that is routinely cited here is work by Labov, which centers on narratives as standalone texts, past events recalled through story. Those familiar with Labov's work will recognize this focus on abstract orientation, complication, resolution, and coda as what are referred to as fully formed narratives. This can be combined with positioning analysis, but the focus from Labov was really on identifying these whole narratives, these fully formed narratives that stand alone and essentially separate from other conversation. If you're interested in Labov, I also appreciate Gordon's work, Labov, A Guide for the Perplexed, which would describe my state of mind when I first encountered Labov. So the other aspect of narrative analysis really focuses on social interactional analysis. And this is where Michael Bamberg's work has had a really big influence and is really important for folks to consider if they are thinking about positioning analysis. Bamberg foregrounds narrative identity as performed action, that is, as narrating subject in agent. Michael also writes about this in chapter 2, some of the aspects and thinking around different metaphors of position. Defina and Georgia Capullo focus on narrative as talk in interaction and as social practice. So again, distinguishing between those sort of life history approaches or Labov's decontextualized narrative that stands apart as a whole. They are focused on, as is Bamberg, narrative and talk in interaction. There's also been a focus on small story or big story research, and Georgia Capullo points out this isn't meant to be a binary, but rather small stories bring attention to to the parts that other approaches, such as Labov's structural approach or life history, may not be considered a fully formed narrative. So if you think about the ways that people engage in everyday conversation, we'll have these little narratives that are formed. They're not necessarily the complete narratives that Labov has spoken about. George Capullo also notes that tellability cannot be defined outside of situatedness, where the stories are told, by whom, with whom, and why. So in other words, looking at stories in context within interaction is really important. And Defina also observes that the latter focus on the process of identity construction itself, the strategies used by narrators, co-narrators, and their audience to achieve, contest, and reaffirm specific identities is part of this interactional approach. And this is very much what that branch that Michael Bamberg and others have developed. So there are some differences, and I want to just point out one of those that Michael Bamberg has made in distinguishing work between his own approach and that of Davies and Hooray. He discusses being subjected to discourses versus subjectively constructing discourses. So he elaborates the problem with the macro social orders and argues that the alternative view that he proposes provides a contrast to Davies and Hooray because, and this middle block is a quote where he says, a constructivist and social constructionist perspective that operates strictly bottom up construes the individual person as actively and agentively positioning him or herself. Here, the person is not viewed as being subjected to previous discourses or narratives, but rather as subjectively constructing these discourses. In doing this, the person constructs him or herself as agent and subject, that is, as somebody who is accountable for his or her actions and words. In brief, Bamberg and others find the hooray notion of moral orders to be problematic because the existence of those moral orders presumes that a person is subject to particular discourses, and that's something that might be worth talking about, and maybe also when Michael's available, we can have a conversation around that as well. But he does distinguish between those aspects. One of the things, if you're here as a person who has been interested in narrative research but hasn't done this yet, or you're starting to do some narrative and positioning approach, one of the questions that oftentimes comes up is, what is the best approach to narrative positioning analysis? And one of the things that Michael Bamberg has pointed out numerous times in his research is that, there is no best approach. There's a quote from Dafina and Georgia Kapulu where I think they put this very well. They say researchers who start in narrative studies are eager to find methods that can help them both define their object of investigation and study it. The reality is that there is no one fit for all method of narrative analysis. Methodological choices, which are often eclectic, combine insights and conceptions that come from different disciplines. This narrative research is highly interdisciplinary, but I would also could be even more so if we draw across these different branches and think about what they can contribute. I also want to just end with one recommendation for anybody who might be new to narrative analysis and wondering, like, where do I start? Sometimes there's a lot of theory. There's a lot of other things that you can read. In the chapter, we cite a lot of different resources that I think are helpful. But if I had to list one piece for novices who are interested in narrative analysis, I would probably start with Michael Bamberg's 2020 piece, which is called Narrative Analysis: An Integrative Approach, Small Stories and Narrative Practices. And this is a chapter. I won't go into this further. We do include in the chapter a couple of directions for future areas that we would like to see explored, but we've tried to provide both an overview of narrative analysis in relation to positioning and some of the, particularly some of the contributions from Michael Bamberg and colleagues that are focused on these discourse analytic or social interactional traditions of analyzing discourse. And I will stop here and let Pasi put up his slides. Our structure is always to have the first talk, then we do our second talk, and then we have our discussion and question and answer time after that. So Pasi, whenever you're ready to go, you can.
I think I am ready to go. Can you see the slides?
Yes, now they're in presentation mode.
Perfect. I'm working with two screens, so don't mind if I go like this every now and then. Hi everyone, my name is Pasi Hirvonen. I'm a university lecturer of social psychology here at the University of Eastern Finland in Kuopio, where we held the previous positioning theory conference as well this summer. And actually, I'm going to continue from where Mary just finished, or where Mary finished, focusing on the social interaction analysis and positioning theory, especially from the perspective of conversation analysis. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with conversation analysis. I remember the first time I got acquainted with CA, or conversation analysis. It was a bit of a daunting task and overwhelming, but gradually develop a sense of understanding what that is about. And Today, what I want to discuss with you guys is just to present an overview of how to approach systematically the analysis of everyday interactions, utilizing the basic starting points and principles and ideas of conversation analysis, and how those can be connected to or intertwined with positioning theory-oriented analysis. Well, let's see. Here we go. Thank you, Mary, for the wonderful introduction to positioning theory and looking at the history and background. I love the tree model. When it comes to conversation analysis, I would argue that the story or narrative is slightly more straightforward. There are not that many branches or streams of thought or schools or disciplinary boundaries when it comes to conversation analysis. Rather, it's rather straightforward analytical framework that is actually one of the few qualitative inquiries and methodologies that currently generates cumulative data on or cumulative knowledge on social orders and everyday interactions. But the purpose of the chapter overall is to present or explore the methodological potential of employing conversation analysis in positioning theory research. And the chapter argues that conversation analysis provides a methodological procedures for analyzing interpersonal positioning, constructing personal and social storylines, for instance, and establishing local normative orders in interaction. Now, I have the famous Rom Harry quote here, and this is something that is, I think, the nexus of positioning theory and conversation analysis. Both of these approaches emphasize the centrality of conversations as being the key domain of social research or level of analysis when we want to make sense of interpersonal relations. And despite being distinct forms of, let's say, discursive psychology, conversation analysis and positioning theory still share several key similarities. Nowadays, conversation analysis seems to be the go-to method when it comes to discursive psychology, especially. But both approaches are trying to make sense of what are the building blocks of conversations and therefore the building blocks of intersubjective reality. The contents of the chapter is, of course, it includes the introduction, but it presents a brief history of conversation analysis. It's relatively important to take a look at where the concepts have derived from or stemmed from, then presenting the starting points of conversation analysis, comparison between conversation analysis and positioning theory, introducing some methodological and analytical procedures, not necessarily the ABCs of doing conversation analysis and positioning analysis, but at least some sort of starting points as to where to get started and how to get started. And I also provide some analytical examples of my previous research on interaction studies and how conversation analysis has been or can be utilized in those contexts. So my background is in social psychology and especially small group studies and small group interaction studies, looking at the everyday lives of small groups in different kinds of contexts, in which I have utilized both conversation and analytical starting points and positioning theory as well. Looking briefly to the history of conversation analysis, it was highly influenced by the works of Harold Garfinkel and Erving Goffman, especially Garfinkel's works on ethnomethodology, basically trying to explain how everyday social order is possible, how do individuals, groups navigate in these everyday life settings and make sense of what is going on, in addition to Erving Goffman's face-to-face interactions and the study of interaction orders. So basically what makes everyday social order possible. Harvey Sachs was the key developer of conversation analysis together with his colleagues in the 1960s and early 1970s in the US. And Sachs was actually a student of Erving Goffman and was quite familiar also with ethnomethodology and Harold Garfinkel's work. And to some extent wasn't that pleased with the detailed of analysis that, for instance, ethnomethodology presented, and wanted to develop a more systematic way of looking into the social interactions and social orders of everyday lives. and therefore gradually developed conversation analysis together with his colleagues. Some key works come from Sachs and his pioneering work studying phone calls from Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center. I think it was the early 60s, 1960s, and presents a relatively groundbreaking idea of looking at naturally occurring data as the starting points of social research or analysis of interpersonal relationships, instead of doing laboratory experiments or questionnaires and so on and so forth. There are many histories written about the background and history of both conversation analysis and works of Harvey Sachs that can be found elsewhere as well. So when it comes to conversation analysis, the overall point or aim of the analysis is to look at how a shared understanding is achieved in everyday interactions. And based on a large amount of empirical conversation analytical research, some key principles can be presented as to what kinds of steps or starting points should be taken into account when conducting conversation analysis. First of all, social order is considered to be built through everyday interactions. Therefore, conversations and interactions are the foremost key area of research and interest. Talk is also considered as action. This might seem relatively simple or self-evident. However, talk is not just talk or communication, but it's also or always some sort of action that orients towards others in that specific episode, for instance. And perhaps counterintuitively, often we might consider everyday conversations as kind of chaotic or hard to make sense of, but based on conversation analytical viewpoints, conversations are actually quite orderly and structured. These can be analyzed or approached from looking at sequence organizations in everyday interactions or turn designs in everyday interactions, but I'll give examples of these perhaps later. And conversations are always a product of joint action and how intersubjective reality comes about. Now I'm taking the hat of reviewer number 2. Doing interaction analysis and focusing on positioning theory, quite often the comment or question might be, why don't you do just conversation analysis? Or if you do conversation analytical work, is there room for positioning theory oriented analysis in that same piece of work? And I would argue that yes, there is. Where conversation analysis, its scholarly roots are in microsociology, ethnomethodology, and the study of social order. It represents a theoretical, or some refer to it as anti-essential starting points. There is no identity lurking behind the talk or text somewhere in between the ears, but identity is something that is co-constructed in everyday interactions. The use of naturalistic interaction data is central, looking at everyday events. The analysis logic follows induction and unmotivated reading, so we don't use prior concepts or categories through which we look at the data. And the analytical focus is on micro perspectives of social interactions and social order. Well, positioning theory has different kinds of scholarly or scientific roots, just as Mary previously presented. Perhaps the overall idea of positioning theory is more theoretically or conceptually driven than conversation analysis, for instance. Focuses on study of normative or moral orders in everyday life. And the focus of analysis is not just on everyday conversations or interactions between individuals or groups, but any kinds of data or text, or even multimodal visual analysis as well. Often, not always, the analysis logic is abductive, having a dialogue between the conceptual starting points and the data itself, and the perspective can be considered to be utilized in both micro to macro levels of analysis. The key similarities, of course, are the interest in conversations, and focusing on that social realm is the primary focus of analysis. Talk is considered to be action. Positioning is not just isolated event, it's always relational and takes into account others in interaction as well. Both represent a form of discursive psychology. Analysis focuses on subject position and situated identities, quite often from an immanentist perspective, looking at when things happen in real life, and also using or focusing on discourse, discursive action, and also multimodality. Just to provide some sort of steps as to how to get started with interaction analysis, and what kinds of research would entail conversation analytical analysis. First of all, the data comes from natural episodes using audio and or video recordings of naturally occurring data. Jonathan Potter would call this that the study survives the dead scientist test. So the data exists without the scientist being alive, basically. So there is no need for interventions or collecting interview data and so on. So it is something that already exists out there in the real world. Doing detailed transcriptions so that the nuanced and detailed parts and sequences of interactions can be analyzed. Starting the analysis with unmotivated reading, going through, perhaps looking at similarities or differences in different kinds of interactional phases or sequences or storytelling and so on, which is followed by selection of specific sequences. Let's say we are interested in doctor-patient interactions and especially how those interactions get started. So naturally, those sequences of interaction would be of interest, and what kinds of functions they include, and how the participants orient towards each other's talk. This is done by turn-by-turn analysis, looking at each turn and how they relate to the previous or the next turn in the interaction. Sequence organization, looking at how these turns form different kinds of sequences in the interaction. And further can be analyzed from the perspective of looking at different lexical choices, different kinds of categories or epistemic word that comes about in the interaction. Quite often the logic is that analysis starts from a single case and then looking the whole data more broadly and then comparing these cases and perhaps presenting some sorts of ideas of 2 different or 3 different kinds of ways of initiating patient and doctor interactions, for example. In this chapter, I provide 4 analytical examples of utilizing conversation analysis in positioning theory-driven research. First is analyzing structural organization and turn-taking in interaction, looking at the construction of interpersonal positions through turn-taking, how individuals orient towards each other's talks and turns, and analyzing storytelling in interaction, how small stories are constructed in interaction, and how positioning and personal storylines come about, and how third-order positioning can be analyzed. In addition, there are examples of analyzing lexical choices in interaction, and especially how these relate to the construction of normative orders when it comes to conversations, and also analyzing epistemic work in interaction, basically who has the right to knowledge in a specific episode or instance. I will just show 2 examples, not going into detail to the analysis, but these come from naturally occurring data from different contexts. The first one is from a franchise company that focuses on brokering rental apartments. It's a weekly meeting, and the participants are discussing financial issues and buying a new product to the firm. But how the conversation analytical analysis would proceed would be starting to point out what are the agency pairs or the pairs that orient towards each other in the interactions. Anneli introduces a new topic here, which is followed by a 1 second long pause. Based on previous studies in conversation analysis, even a pause that is longer than 0.3 seconds has an implication in interaction. For instance, a long pause longer than 0.3 seconds might implicate that the next turn doesn't necessarily prefer the previous turn. Something negative might come about. Or it might just open a place for someone else to take the turn or the space in the interaction. It's referred to as transition relevance place in conversation analytical terms. Kinesis offers a question and extends the previous turn. Anneli answers and provides a further extension, and the interaction goes on by opening another topic and asking a question. And there's a minor detail here, which comes from conversation analysis, looking at the lexical choices, like the word well here. The previous turn in lines 8 and 9 was done in a laughing voice, and the well here, according to conversation analytical understanding, is a kind of a boundary marker that might present a new topic, but also change of state marker that kind of indicates that the previous turn, even though it was said out loud laughing, it is considered to be relevant and considered seriously. And there's another example of epistemic work in interaction from an interprofessional team meeting in elderly care in Finland, looking at how a doctor, for instance, presents to the interdisciplinary team a patient case, talking about a patient and their well-being and how they are managing themselves at home. And then a home health service director continues, stating something more in addition to what the doctor has said. And the epistemics here refers to the idea that doctor hasn't got the first place experience or hands-on experience with the person in question, but the home health service director has been to the elderly person's home and knows how things are, and slightly challenges and marks a bit of a transition and addition to the previous turn in interaction. And of course, this results in the creation of intersubject positions in interaction. All right. As you've probably noticed, the language and jargon of conversation analysis is quite technical. It takes some time to get to know how and what specific terms and concepts refer to. But the overall point is that conversation analysis offers a systematic way of approaching everyday interactions and conversations, which is also the focus of, if we look at positioning theory or oriented analysis and interactions. Quite often when reviewing works on positioning theory that has focused on utilizing naturalistic interactions, sometimes something is lost. For instance, when the analytical procedures have been done according to, let's say, content analysis and not sequential interaction analysis. I'm not denying that content analysis couldn't be used, but interaction analysis perhaps offers a more nuanced understanding of what is going on and how actually individuals and discussants orient towards each other's actions in conversations. Well, the conclusions you can find from the chapter, but perhaps just stating that there is a bit of a challenge looking at conversation analysis that takes a step away from theoretical conceptualizations and then combining that with positioning theory that is somehow entangled with these histories and backgrounds and concepts. And perhaps we might need other methodologies to support our interpretations of our findings in terms of positioning methods, just such as ethnography, for instance. I'm going to finish with Elizabeth Stocko's analogy of conversational racetracks. she refers to conversation analysis of kind of investigative work of looking at what is going on in each kinds of conversations and what is the conversational racetrack. For instance, when people go out and have lunch and they're queuing to pay for the lunch, or when we go to therapist office or to doctor's office, what is the conversational racetrack and how that is constructed through interactions. And then, of course, combining the positioning racetrack alongside the conversational racetrack as well. All right, I think that's all I have for today.
Thank you, Pasi, for that wonderful overview of your chapter and the work on conversation analysis and positioning. For those of you who may be with us for the first time, if you're not familiar with this format, what we typically do is you can post questions or comments into the chat. You can also use the raise hand feature in Zoom. Folks do help me out because sometimes we miss folks who are using that feature. If you're comfortable going on video or unmuting, you can also ask a question orally or make a comment as well. These are meant to be dialogic spaces, so everything is welcome in terms of questions or comments, and you can ask those in whatever format is most comfortable to you. So I'm going to stop talking here. I see Luke has his hand raised, so I will turn things over to Luke.
Thank you very much. And thank you and thank Pasi for two very interesting papers. Both show that there is indeed a big need within positioning theory to have the right, let's say, analytical, technical methods to collect data, to analyze data, and to link it to the theory. And that's good work. And of course, we can see that there are different communities existing. There's discourse people, discourse analysis, the narratologists, the ethnographic ones, etc., etc. But what struck me is that let me put it in a different way. For me, one of the key issues of positioning theory is that conversations are seen in a theoretical way, not only as a tool to collect data. Let me explain this. You have the differences between written and oral languages, and one of the key issues of Ron Harris' work, especially that with Mulhauser, is that the orality, the oral language, has some specific distinct features that make it that it is exactly that reality that is the core of society, of social interactions. And I was wondering, and this is a question to both of you, how you think you can bridge the theoretical notion of conversation in positioning theory with the notion of conversation as is used in the analytical methods that you both discussed. And because for me, that is the more, I'm even up to the point now that I'm wondering if conversation analysis, stick to sensu or narratology or something else, is the right method to analyze things in terms of positioning theory, because there we speak about the power of speech act and when and how a speech act can have certain powers. Do you need that kind of analytical thinking and data crunching for answering those questions? And by all means, I'm not anti-empiricist. I think we need good data and as much as possible, but it's the way that we think about it, that we deal with it, that is puzzling me in a way. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke, for the question. Quite a bit to tackle. But I think when it comes to, if I understood correctly, the idea of conversations, not just looking at literally or explicitly talks between individuals, but taking a more theoretical aspect, I completely agree. However, when it comes to the empirical side of things, then we need different methodologies. I think this is now I'm lost for words, sorry. The positive of positioning theory that it allows for looking at the, let's say, conversation in a more broad sense than, let's say, ethnomethodology and conversation analysis would perhaps do. Okay, I'm gonna stop here and let Mary continue, and then we can go back and forth if Mary, you have something to add.
Yeah, I guess like you said, there's a lot there to unpack. And I agree there are some distinctions that are important, especially that difference between oral and written. Although I'm also wondering how some of these distinctions are changing, right? Because written text used to be written and, for example, in a printed book, right? The structure was there, whereas now we have all these digital environments which combine so many different types of modality, which I'm not quite sure what to do with that. I think that probably matters, and some of us have written and explored that to some extent, but I think there's a lot more that probably could be explored there. I also think there's always a tension between the theoretical notions of positioning and thinking about some of these concepts that Ram and others have introduced, and then what happens when you actually start working with data, because the applications to data shift the ways you think about theory, but also I think the theory shifts the way you think about data. So I think there always needs to be an iterative and dialogic engagement with the theory, between the theory and the data. I don't know if that's part of what Luke, what you were thinking about, or do we need, I don't know, another question that comes to mind too is do we need other specific types of methodologies? The part about that kind of concerns me is I don't think we want to reify or set these codify particular approaches and say these are the positioning analyses people need to do. I think the pluralities of approaches is useful, but that's for me, it raises a lot more questions than it does answers, I guess, in terms of that. And I don't know, Luke, if you want to weigh in here on Pasi's comments or my own, or just further elaborate your own ideas.
Well, actually, I wasn't expecting real answers to my question. Just that I wanted to share with you that I'm puzzled by a couple of things at this moment. And I mean, for instance, talking about conversations. This morning, I had a conversation with my fishmonger. And the first thing when I entered the shop was that I said, "Isn't it a beautiful day?" And he replied by something, I don't remember what. And then the next question I asked him was, "How's your wife doing?" Because I knew that she had some medical issues and stuff like that. So we had a whole conversation that in communication terms had nothing to do with me buying fish from the fishmonger who sells fish. And you can measure that, you can quantify that, you can make transcripts for qualitative analysis, yes, but you could also do something else. You could have a chat with the fishmonger or with me separately and say, okay, what are the things that you talk about in the shop? Why do you do that? And stuff like that. Is that not a more efficient way to get the things out of that reality that is of interest to us, rather than doing the strict to sensu conversation analysis? I'm still looking for good wording to it, but there is something that bothers me. And this has nothing to do with both of you having a very good chapter.
Well, thank you, Luke. I appreciate that. Pasi, were you going to say something or no?
Well, I would just say that sometimes the reality might turn out to be more complex or intriguing that we might get out of those interviews and asking for what is it that you think that might happen and take place in those interactions. Okay.
Okay, we do have a few questions that have come in, and I see that Asma has a hand raised. So Asma, do you want to ask your question or comment?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Did you hear me?
Yes, I think we can hear you.
Okay. So my question related to the conversation analysis and the positioning theory. It's about when we are comparing these two things. So my question is very simple, and that is when we compare to both things like positioning theory or positioning analysis and conversation analysis, uh, it appeared to me that positioning theory is the kind of comprehensive framework where you can, at micro level and where you can analyze even conversation or the interaction at micro level as well as macro level. So why conversation analysis in that case is needed if positioning theory is there? This is my first question. And since I'm also the student of Professor Luke Van Lagenov, and he's also here, if he's listening me, I also have a question to him that I was reflecting from some time, but I couldn't ask. And that is when we talk about moral orders, and we say that positioning theory tells us about what is not only focuses on what is being said, but also what is allowed to say, you know. But I was thinking from very long time that why are not we focusing on what we want to say? You know, something different from what is being said, what is allowed to say, and what we want to say. So yeah, this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Pasi, do you want to respond first to the conversation
Yeah.
analysis?
It's an important question to ask because it could go the other way around. Let's say we are in an ethnomethodology conversation analysis conference and I present something with positioning theory. So the question would be, where do you need positioning theory? You have everything you need when you look at conversations from a conversation analytical perspective. But I would argue that to get a hold of the interactional data or the phenomenon itself, I don't think positioning theory necessarily provides those analytical procedures that you can go into detail, looking at the micro features of interaction and how, when actually things happen, as they happen, how they happen. So I think conversation analysis can turn out to be quite beneficial because it allows to look at the really, really small microscopic details of interaction that actually play a significant role when it comes to interpersonal positioning and the construction of, let's say, situational rights or duties. Yeah.
Pasi, before we turn to Luke's response to the other question, I'm wondering if that also relates to the use of conversation analysis also relates to the ways that cultural differences can be taken into account. One of the questions that came in was, in terms of positioning theory, what role can cultural differences be taken into account? For example, Gumper's is crosstalk. So I guess that pertains to both some of the traditional conversation analysis work, but also some of the positioning theory. And that might be something that Luke might have comments about as well. So Luke, I'll turn to you in a moment to get your response to Asma's questions, but also feel free to weigh in on this. So Pasi?
I think definitely positioning theory offers a perspective of approaching that. When it comes to conversation analysis, there are some studies that look at perhaps even I would say cultural differences, but the thing is conversation analysis doesn't start with the category or position in that sense, looking at, okay, we might have cultural differences, but actually how those cultural features are brought about as topics or interpersonal positions in interactions. So there's a bit of a difference there. I know there is not much work done looking at these broader issues, but that's one of the reasons.
Thank you, Pasi. So Luke, would you like to comment on Asa's question about that she mentioned the what is said, what one is allowed to say, but also why we maybe don't focus as much on what we want to say? Where does that play a part in positioning theory? And then this other question also about cultural differences that has come up.
By the way, thank you, Asma, for your excellent question. The thing is that indeed, in his later work, Ron Harry has advanced this idea that we should make a distinction between three realms of, let's say, conversational reality. That is what people are doing, one, two, what people can do, the capacities that we have to do and the skills that we have to do, and three, the appropriateness of the things that we are doing. And you could add a fourth one, that is indeed what we intend to do. Right? So, for instance, I can say at this moment, I would love to play piano. Why don't I do it? Well, because it would not be appropriate in a meeting on positioning theory to start playing the piano rather than trying to say something more or less intelligent. By the way, I don't have any skills to play piano, so that would even make my case worse. But nevertheless, if there would be a piano in here, or maybe if I can turn my keyboard into a piano, I could do something. I could produce some noise at that very end. So there are these different things. And the point that Ron wants to make over and over is that we have been focusing on what people do or not do, and on the capacities they have to do that. But we have not paid much attention to the normative aspects, to the things, how we judge the situation, for the things that we can do, that we think is appropriate to do. And that indeed is something I think a very important element of positioning theory. And I'm not yet sure how we can grasp that with conversational analysis, because these are the things that are happening not in the things that you say in the conversation, but in the things that you think about during the conversation, that you say, maybe this is not a good time to play piano, so I will not do it. And indeed, I will not play piano and I will stop here.
Thank you very much for answering the question.
Thank you, Asma. There is a question that has been posted in the chat from Khalid Al-Jahani that says, how can we effectively integrate position into our lives? I'm sorry, how can we effectively integrate positioning theory into our survey design to enhance data validity? Are there specific challenges you've encountered when using positioning theory in conjunction with surveys, or the using of survey, will that limit the theory? And I'm going to let somebody else take this question because I'm getting a call from our department secretary and I'm in charge of a search. So I think this is important. So I'll turn things over to Luke, Pasi, Bo, Cindy, anybody else who wants to weigh in. Some of you have done the research, not so much with theory, but I think with other things. So I will be right back.
There's someone who has conducted survey research, for instance, and combined positioning theory. I think this is a question for every one of us.
Sorry, I didn't see I was still muted. Well, this indeed is something that it is one of the things that is bothering me more and more. It is, how can we analyze that aspect of reality by using data as transcripts? Because for me, these are the things that are going on in our minds and that affect what we are saying, affects the power that we can give to speech acts. But I'm not sure if it's observable, if it's traceable with classical transcripts of interviews. You see what I mean? Did you hear it?
Yeah, thank you, Luke. It looks like Susan has raised her hand. Did you want to contribute to the conversation, Susan, about this topic?
Thanks.
Yes, I speak in my most recent book about storyline. And perhaps this is sort of a departure, I don't know, but of storyline as something that can be contested. I'm an educator, and I think about classroom interactions, and specifically the authority of different classroom members to speak and to play various roles in constructing knowledge. And so, you know, it seems like cultural differences, but also, you know, positional differences in terms of what's even happening or what should be happening can be embedded within storylines. So in a survey, those kinds of questions can be explicitly asked. That comes to mind. I don't, I just want to thank both of the presenters, because I find this methodological synthetic thinking so very important. And I guess the way I'm thinking about positioning theory is that it provides a meta-theoretical construct within which we can import a lot of important theoretical resources, and insists on us having, you know, a balance of theoretical resources to look at any discursive exchange from these different perspectives. And what I really appreciate, you know, about Pasi in particular, was very clear about the importance also of having very clear understandings up front in our research about why we've treated our data in a certain way, why we've collected it and treated it in a certain way. And for one, I really appreciate, you know, the idea of having established data treatments that allow you to build in the way he spoke about upon each other's work, which is not to say that everyone needs to be doing that in that way. And certainly it wouldn't be particularly appropriate for questions I'm interested in, for instance. But I am grateful for your treatment of conversation analysis, because I was always trying to exactly understand how it, you know, the worth of that tradition and where it intersects with the thinking I do. So I just really enjoyed today's presentations. But so anyway, I don't know, because I haven't been part of this community. I've read positioning theory on my own, and I couldn't make it to Finland, although I had a paper accepted and really wanted to come and wasn't able to come at the end. So I am kind of on my own out here, but I do feel like positioning theory, because, you know, gives us this meta framework for the second cognitive revolution, the way, you know, its founders have spoken about, that allows us to, you know, just bring in all this great work that's happened kind of, you know, in so many places against the first cognitive revolution. So it feels, you know, just synthetic at that level also. So thank you.
There was somebody who raised the issue of what can positioning theory mean in our everyday lives. I think that's also a very important issue that I would like to bring in this conversation. That is that the different storylines that we can identify, people are not always aware of that storyline. And it's good, I think, that we can do research in two phases, so to speak. First phase is that we collect storylines, that we make a kind of a taxonomy of what kind of storylines are possible or usable in a certain situation. And then you confront people with that repertoire on storylines, and you can then, it narrows the bridge between doing research to, let's say, to identify new things, and the things of, yeah, well, I wouldn't say educating, but having some kind of learning behavior with people. And that, for me, is a big potentiality of positioning theory that is not well fully embraced yet.
Thank you, Luke. We're just about out of time, but I did see that Maria put a question into the chat. And Pasi, I don't know if this is something you want to comment on regarding I see Bo just has commented too. So I guess, Bo, if you want to weigh in here, go ahead and respond to that. And question about wondering whether CA is really a hybrid approach that provides more analytical tools and what the usefulness is about. So anybody want to take up that question?
Well, of course, that is a criticism that conversation analysis quite often faces, and rightfully so. I'm not entirely sure if I understood the question correctly, but the thing often is that with conversation analysis, looking at interactions, you try to stick with that data as it is, looking at what's going on here, how one orients towards one another without explicitly integrating that with some sort of understanding, such as interaction process analysis, for instance, might do. But when it comes to whether it is a hybrid methodology, I don't think I'm the correct person to answer this question.
Go ahead, Maria.
So I guess my question is that absolutely true that it's totally a bottom-up approach, that the analyst, the researcher who looks at this data is able to block out, right, the kind of theoretical and experiential knowledges that they bring to that to study of that interaction? And my answer all these years has been no, even if, you know, the approach really claims to do that. When you look at, for example, you know, the example that you brought up, Pasi, about the doctor and, you know, the caregiver. I can't remember if it was exactly a caregiver, right? I mean, you go into, you look at this, you first of all have concepts about what the caregiver does. And that's why you look at what they say in this kind of particular way. So I understand the relative foregrounding, backgrounding of bottom-up versus top-down interpretations and all this stuff. I'm all good about this. That's my problem with grounded theory too, all these years, which is really, truly, these are not pure approaches. That's why I kind of call it hybrid. Hybrid may not be the right word to really use, but in some ways, the interpreters kind of positioning relatively to what they know about the world and what they're looking for in the data, it comes out. I mean, it's impossible, in my perspective, to treat that as totally, you know, an empirical data that somebody analyzes only from a data point of view and not a conceptual kind of point of view that the analyst comes with. So that's, and maybe that's why I was saying there might be interesting to see what are the storylines of these researchers who look at this data in this presumably bottom-up way.
Thanks, Maria. We'll take one closing comment from Bo, and then unfortunately that will have to close out our time today.
I just want to say that I agree with Mariah in terms of that. And that's why I think if you read lectures on conversation by Harvey Sachs, I think it's filled with kind of like personal impressions and observations as well, which it brings it much more closer to what Mariah is actually trying to say. So I think it's much more aligned with ethnomethodology in Sachs' phase, where what it's they are exploring. And I think Garfinkel's frequent references to shoots here is important. So what they explore is actually the common life world instead, which makes the process between the analyst and the empirical data a much more a kind of dialogue instead of kind of like blocking out the analyst's prepositions and understanding of what this is. So I think there's a difference between those, and I think Sachs is much more close to Garfinkel in the early parts than Slickoff and Johnson and stuff. I don't know if that makes sense, but
I think
Well,
it's
we
it's
have to,
captures the
yeah.
essence of what positioning theory tries to do. The idea that we can never escape to be in the reality that we are investigating, but then we should have the tools to make it visible, to make people aware of it. That's the best we can do.
Mhm. We are always caught in that web of conversations, and our conversation is going to have to stop here, and we'll have to pick up the threads of this and in the future. So as always, thank you so much for Pasi for sharing your ideas today and for everybody's questions and comments. We really appreciate it. And we thank you for joining us today. Have a good day or have a good evening. Thanks, everybody.
All right.